A little while ago, I had said that I thought that Neomads, the organization started by Judge and Caesar Clown, was going to be incorporated into Cross Guild, including characters such as Vegapunk Lilith, Buckingham Stussy, and Queen, also known now as Cian. But going off of that, I also said that I thought Apoo was going to join Cross Guild in the future, bringing along NB as a bargaining chip because he might have known that when Cross Guild was still Buggy's delivery service, that Buggy's delivery service lost the service of the new giant warrior pirate. So, as a bargaining chip, he would offer up NB, who is an ancient giant. Therefore, you could say that he's the equivalent of 5 normal giants or possibly greater than 5 normal giants. With that being said, the reason why I think Apoo is such an important character for the story moving forward is because even though the supernovas were like a secondhand thought, or at least that's how the idea is presented to us from what we've heard over the years, it's very interesting how so much is influenced by Apoo. Like when you think about the entire long arm culture as we've known it so far has been started with Apoo as the genesis point. And I think, too, Apoo is the reason why Brook's story turns out the way it does, because it's very interesting, too, that the Long Arm Tribe members who eventually become Brook's managers are initially dressed very similarly to Apoo. So Apoo is the culture setter for the Long Arm Tribe. That's interesting when you really stop to think about it, because he's the first one that we meet in the narrative. So that's why I think Apoo within himself is a more important character than many people originally think that he is. But going off of that, it's not surprising that he would be the culture setter for quite a few of the Long Arm Tribe members in the series, because he himself is based off of a real world pirate, like how some characters are in the series. So he is based off of 19th century Chinese pirate, and forget my pronunciation, Chu Apoo. And if Apoo existed in the real world, he would be from China. So that reflects his namesake origin from this Chinese pirate. So that makes a lot of sense. On top of that, it's very interesting too that as we get more and more about his powers throughout the story, because he's one of the last supernovas that get a fruit name revealed. After him, of course, is Bonnie, and we're still waiting on Rouge. But it's funny how we get this reveal after the time skip, because after the time skip, of course, you know, Brook's powers are revealed. And the interesting thing between Apoo and Brook is that even before the time skip, it was mentioned in a very, very short period of time before Apoo's reveal that Brook's music, much like Apoo's, can affect people, because during the fight between the Straw Hats and the Flying Fish Riders, Brook uses his music offensively in battle for the first time, and it puts the Flying Fish Riders and Luffy to sleep. Going off of that, shortly afterward is Sabaody Archipelago. We are introduced to Apoo, and we get to see his powers for the first time and find out they too are sound based. Now, on top of that, it's very interesting when you consider that Brook has the ability to use his music as a conduit for his soul to affect the souls of living persons, right? With that being said, it's very funny that in Wano we find out the whole bit of how the Tone fruit's powers work, which is Apoo's fruit, is that a person actually has to hear the noise for his attacks to go off. They actually have to hear his music. So I find it very funny that both the musical abilities of Brook and Apoo have some sort of stipulation to them. One, Brook's musical capabilities have to be performed on a living being in order to work. And with Apoo, he actually has to have his sound be heard by someone in order for his abilities to work. So with that being said, Brook technically, which is very funny, technically, if we're talking about the Tone fruit working on a purely biological basis, Brooke would be immune to the powers of the Tone fruit because he has no ears to hear. Yo, skull joke. It's very funny. I love that bit about these two because technically Apoo would not be able to affect Brooke, but Brooke could affect Apoo because Brooke's music works through the Yomi Yomi no Mi, the revive fruit, in which he connects to the soul of living people. So as long as the target is a living person, he can affect them very deeply with his music. He does have regular crowd kinesis, as we've seen several times, but the fact that he can affect a living persons in a particular way is interesting. And it's very funny that in a battle of music, he would have the advantage over Apoo, technically. Now, in the video that I mentioned beforehand, I did say that I think Queen and Apoo eventually were going to be a part of Cross Guild, and how I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that relationship is mended, because of course, Queen does technically betray Apoo by making him a sitting duck, giving him the antidote for the Ice Oni virus, right? And everyone's running around trying to kill him for the antidote. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this relationship is repaired, because they kind of have a very similar relationship to Frankie and Brooke. Because before Jinbei joined, which I think that's going to be reverted, but before Jinbei joined, Frankie was the father figure in the whole what if the Straw Hat crew were a family dynamic. Frankie was the father and Brooke was the grandfather. And even as early as Thriller Bark, you see this very interesting relationship forming between Frankie and Brooke. They really do have a father and son, or a brotherly sort of camaraderie between the two, and they're both very interested in music, as Frankie's gag throughout the entirety of him being in the series has been musical upon other things. And of course, Brooke is a musician. Frankie often will pull out a guitar or a ukulele to emphasize how he's feeling. And then Brooke's whole deal is music, as he is the musician of the Straw Hat crew. So with Apoo and Queen, this is sort of flipped, because even though Queen is Frankie's father, he does play a bit of a fatherly role to Apoo. This is flipped because Frankie was the father in being the shipwright, and Brooke was the musician being the grandfather, the father to Frankie, and this whole family dynamic. So if you turn it over to the Cross Guild side of things, Apoo being the musician would be the son, and then Queen, being the older of the two, would be the father. So I think that's a very interesting parallel between the Straw Hats and the Cross Guild if Apoo and Queen end up joining. On top of that, is very interesting too that I don't think that the relationship shown between Apoo and Queen in the manga, and especially in the anime, is going to be wasted, because that whole concert was so bombastic in both versions that the relationship between the two can't really be ignored. It's also very funny that they both have the same hairstyle, like this long Chinese braid. That's cool. That's very cool. I don't know why that is, and they both wear glasses, so that's cool. But what's very interesting too, getting back to the whole devil fruit conversation, is that Brooke and Apoo are in very similar spots because of the body horror inflicted by the situations they have been put in due to their devil fruits. Brooks is a bit more involuntary because, of course, his body decayed away, leaving him bones and hair. So that in itself is terrifying, right? And there's a whole conversation about that. But Apoo is very interesting because he's one of the very few people who's in a body horror situation due to the powers of a paramecia fruit. Because unlike Zoans, the paramecia fruit class doesn't inflict permanent effects all the time. The numbers of permanent effects that paramecia fruits inflict are very few and far between. But the first one in the series to be afflicted by such a effect due to the powers of a paramecia fruit is Buggy, because his power is involuntarily on all the time. And then moving down the list, we have Alvita, who literally had her body transformed via eating the smooth fruit. So Apoo is in good company because we have seen Apoo before he ate the tone fruit. And before he ate the tone fruit, his teeth weren't piano keys. But it's very funny when he's depicted as a child, he is shown with a piano. So that's very interesting that the piano literally became a part of his body moving forward. And then, too, as we see at Sabaody Archipelago, he can turn his various limbs into musical instruments, which in itself is kind of horrible when you think about it. But it's very interesting that his fruit apparently has a permanent effect on him. And the effect appears to be involuntary because the piano teeth are just a thing that shows up all the time after he's eaten the fruit. So that's how he and Brook are similar, because Brook now, thanks to his powers and his particular situation, is a freakish skeleton, and Apoo is a piano teeth freak. So that's very, very interesting within itself. Going off of that too, it's also very funny or interesting that Brook does ice damage on living beings, whereas Apoo does both physical damage, that is cutting, which is interesting with Brook being a swordsman, and explosion damage, which is the opposite of ice. So even in their uses of using music offensively, they seem to be both similar and on opposite sides of the spectrum, because technically both of them do cut, just Apoo does it with his music and Brook does it because he's also a swordsman, and both of them do a kind of elemental damage. Brook is with ice, Apoo is with fire because he makes bombs out of his music. On top of that, when you start to think about Apoo in the narrative, it's very funny that his pirate crew is called the On-Air Pirates, and during the time in which the time skip was going to start, they literally ran on air because they dropped off onto an island in which they were being chased by wild boars, and due to the landscape apparently being invisible, or for whatever reason, they were running on air. This is a funny parallel to one of Brook's abilities because he can run on the water. So in both cases, there has been a situation in which both of them have run on unconventional surfaces. That's not an important note, but I thought it was a very interesting note. Now, in that video in which I stated that I think Neomats is going to become a part of CrossGuild, I also mentioned that Moria and Perona were also joining CrossGuild, and they would offer up their base, Thriller Bark, to be the official headquarters of CrossGuild, which of course provides certain advantages in being a mobile base, especially considering that they are in the business of hunting marines. So on that, Thriller Bark does have a lot of musical implications behind it. One, because obviously it's named in part after Michael Jackson's Thriller, in which that is a music video and song in which Michael Jackson both dances with zombies and becomes a zombie himself during the events of the music video. And in the arc Thriller Bark, of course, we have zombies dancing to disco at one point. And of course, this is the musical arc because the Straw Hats musician Brook joins during this arc. So the musical theming of Thriller Bark can't really be denied there. But what's very interesting about this and how it relates back to Apoo is that in the pre-time skip and the post-time skip, Apoo is wearing red. Now, it does look like traditional Chinese garb. It's said to be a manfu or a kuzan. Forgive my pronunciation. I'll put a picture of those up on screen here, but it's said to be a riff off of that. And then in the post-time skip, it appears that he's wearing frog fastenings across his chest. Now, what's interesting about the fastening is that you also find those type of fastenings in some marching band uniforms or something very similar. And his birthday is in March. But what relates this back to Thriller Bark is that in the music video, Michael Jackson is also wearing red. So I'm not sure if all these things are connected to one another, but the coincidences are very, very interesting to me. And him being born on the 19th of March could relate back to his namesake being a pirate from the 19th century, which in itself also is very interesting. But to continue, this too could also be a very odd coincidence, but it's something interesting that I just wanted to point out. In Japanese, his fruit is called the Oto Oto no Mi. However, it's translated into English as the Tone fruit. Now, why is this interesting? It's interesting because we know that the dial that is within Brook's head that contains the last song of the Rhubarb Pirates is called a tone dial. So in a way, you can say both of them contain something called tone within their person. With Apoo, he has the powers of the tone fruit, and Brook's skull contains a tone dial. So that is interesting. I don't know if that goes anywhere, but I wanted to point that out because I found it quite the odd similarity. But to move on to our final thoughts, if Apoo were to join Crossgill, this will further increase the similarities between Crossgill and the Straw Hats because the Straw Hats currently have Ideo. Ideo is a long-armed tribe member who is the captain of the Ideo Pirates and the captain of the 4th ship of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. Like Apoo, even though he does not have a dull fruit, he too can cause explosions, though he does it via punching. So that in itself is very interesting. And like Apoo as well, he has a long braid. But he's one of the few long-armed tribe members in this series who is a pure breed, as far as we know, to not be dressed in Chinese-style garb. So that in itself is quite interesting. But with that being said, that's all I have here today. Give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Works.